I was interested in what you were saying about music being inherent or learnt earlier, minor keys, whether that was something you learnt that as being sad, or whether that was cultural, or I was just wondering if you could talk more about that, because it sounds very interesting.
Yes, so that idea, there's a mixture of both. As usual, whenever you have those discussions, is it we born with it? Is it innate, or was it acquired through culture? It's always a bit of both. There's always a lot of biology and culture, and it's trying to find out how they combine, or what the balance is, or which parts of what we do are answerable to which of those things. And in the case of music, it's whenever music that's been continuing in, say, one key departs from that and becomes changing, that's signaling a change, which often signals some emotional difference because of how our physiology, our body reacts when we change from being happy to sad, or elated, or in grief, or any of these sudden shifts and changes. And it's whichever your culture represents as the key that it usually uses. It's the going to the other key, change, the departure from that signals sad music. So that's why we automatically think, well, it must be the minor key, but that's because so much of our music is in the major key. So when we go into minor, then that signals something's different, something's changed. But in a lot of Arabic music, you will have it the other way around. You will have that the minor key is the one that suffuses most of the music, and so changing to the major key will be sad. But it's really about signaling change, which I think is what gives you that analogy between the sequence, the timing, the mood of the music, and the emotions in us, and the way in which our emotions actually come out through the body and through changes in breath, changes in tempo. So I think that's how it works.
There's a question in the front.
Hi. I'm not very good at this. So related to what you were just saying about the idea that your perception of emotion in music is often tied to human emotion. So if it's quicker, that's often more excitable emotions, or like fear, or if it's slower, it's more sad and stuff. So I was wondering if you could relate emotional experience of music and how that affects you yourself to how you empathize to people. So supposedly if you have better levels of empathy, whether that would increase emotional reactions to music, and whether you could measure that. Just a little brainwave I had there.
I think, it's a great question, and there's a lot of very complicated stuff to say in there. It's very interesting that empathy and a tendency to have a lot of emotions don't always go together. So the sentimental and mawkish can feel sort of a huge amount of their own emotion and be really a little bit unmoved by others. I mean, we remember, the famous stories about in the camps, the high-ranking Nazi officials, putting on Beethoven and being incredibly moved, and then being able to go out and perpetuate, the most awful things to other people. So it's difficult to think whether, having engaged your own feelings, you're automatically going to be good at empathizing with other people's feelings. But this is something we know. This is a piece of very new research. Turns out that listening to your own body, being aware of your own body signals, we're all of us very individually different in how well we do that. So your internal senses we often call interoception. And interoception's where you're aware of changes in breath, changes in heartbeat, the stiffening of the musculoskeletal structure when you're angry, the butterflies in the stomach, all of that. Turns out that people are very, very different in their levels of awareness of those changes. So one of the things that you do to measure this, and it's an imperfect measure, but it does, you say to people, okay, I'm going to ask you to count how many heartbeats you've had. Okay, I'm going to ask you to do that. So let's try. So I'm just going to give you 30 seconds because a minute's a long time. So you're not to touch your heart or your wrist. You're to estimate it by yourself. My phone's off, but can somebody give me a 30-second count? Okay, so Steve's going to do that. Okay, so Steve, tell me now. That just keep very still, and just now. Okay, so you're going to be just counting. And stop. So who had a figure in the 20s? Who had a figure in the 30s? Anybody have 40? That's okay, you're not about to die then, that's good. That's very good to know. So, did anybody find it just impossible to do? Right, okay. So, if we had you recorded at the same time that you were doing that, we could measure how accurate you were. And some of you will be absolutely spot on, even though you don't know. None of you know how good you are at that, I think, but we could measure and we'll find it. Some of you are spot on, and some of you are way off. And it turns out that the people who are way off and are not good at reading their own bodily signals, it turns out that they are much slower, much less accurate at reading emotions in other people. So it might be that the better you are tuned to the signals from your own body, the more empathetic you are with other people. Now that's a very interesting finding, because it suggests that we may be able to improve people's level of empathy, because if we gave them feedback measures, now with all the quantified self you can do, you can wear your Apple Watch, you can be getting all your signals. If you were taught to do that better, and you can get better at it, it might be that it increases. Still the jury's out on that, because we haven't done the long-term studies, but might be that that's the way to teach people empathy. Whereas in the camps, the Nazi high-ranking officers who were listening to these wonderful pieces of music and reading great literature, it didn't make them better human beings. So it might actually come down to something really quite elementary, but something we couldn't have known until recent science and neuroscience has helped us examine some of that.
Yeah, we have time for one more question. I see one hand in the middle.
Really interesting question. I just want to know where the first 3 films were shot.
Yeah.
The first 3 films.
Oh.
Where they were where they were from.
Where they were shot?
Yeah.
So the first was a Sufi ritual in Chechnya, the second was folk songs in Chechnya, and the third was in Russia, the fourth Azerbaijan. Is that okay? That was a rubbish last question, but that's okay. I'm only joking.
Were there any other last questions before we close? We could take one more if there were any hands up that I've missed. No? Yep, in the back.
Thanks. So just relating back to what you said about listening to your heartbeat, I mean, would there be then a case for arguing for a particular kind of music to be listened in particular circumstances? So, I mean, I came late, so the last film was a very private listening. So it didn't have a social context. Whereas before the other film, the Mongolian one, that had more of a social context. So is training and listening something that would tie in with training with to empathy?
I think, I think you're right. I mean, it had a social context for them, of course, but I found watching a lot of it incredibly mesmeric. I mean, it was not familiar to me. Some of it a little bit more than others, but wasn't familiar. But amazingly, it sort of gets under the radar of all the ways you usually have of classifying and categorizing and thinking what the music might mean, or music you've already heard does mean for you. It wasn't there, but it was somehow quite involving, and it seemed to involve with the body. And I think the way in which music is imitating the body means that, yes, listening to music that suits you and your current state is probably a synchronization. Very interesting results from a neurologist in Stanford, Joseph Parvizi, who's working with a musicologist, Chris Chafe, and he's taken patients with epilepsy that he studies, and you're getting recordings from the brain musified into two hemispheres. So how you do that is you take the EEG signal. Imagine a single voice, and now oscillate it, and then a different voice for the other hemisphere. Chris Chafe then musified these sounds of the brain, and Joseph then does something very strange. He plays you. He said he just plays you sounds of brains and says, "Is this a normal brain?" And this, and people are 90% correct with no training in EEG. They said, that's normal, that's not, that is, that's not. And what they also say is, when they're listening to, as it were, the brain going bad, they say it's uncomfortable. Why? It must be that they're using their own brain's rhythms to resonate with that. And I think that gives us a deep clue about what music is and about how it satisfies us. So I think that's right. The more you coordinate to music, the more you are learning about something in yourself. So maybe we can train ourselves on that.
Well, I think that's a great note to close on. Thank you so much, Barry, for being here tonight. And thank you, Locha and Steve, for bringing A World Without Words to Frontline. If anybody wants to find out about other events you're putting on in the future, where would be the place for them to look?
aworldwithoutwords.com. Nice and memorable. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.